OPB Podcasts.
Live from the Gerp Well studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, October 2nd. It was a truly spectacular weekend in Portland. It was clear and sunny, not too warm. Leaves were just beginning to change color. People were out and about, biking along the waterfront, going to farmers markets and other early fall activities last weekend. That's why it felt extra weird to hear President Trump call the city war-ravaged on Saturday and then call to send in the National Guard. We are still piecing together what it all means and when troops may march into town. Today, we're going to discuss what we know so far and what we're still learning, and maybe take some questions along the way. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
I'm OPB legal affairs reporter Conrad Wilson.
I'm OPB's public safety reporter Troy Brennelson.
And I'm Dirk Vanderhart. I cover politics.
So a note before we jump into this that we are live on opb.org right now and on our YouTube page. If you have any questions, we will have the ability to answer them in real time. We'll make some time as we go. Let's start with Conrad and Troy. Take us back to last weekend, or I guess late Friday, right? When did you start hearing rumblings about federal troops maybe showing up in Portland, and what did that look like? How did that roll out?
Yeah, so on Friday, midday, I started getting text messages from protesters down at the waterfront who were starting to see influx of new troops that they had not seen before, new faces down near the ICE building, and even armored cars driving around the streets of Portland. And it was those rumors that led to a couple news reports, which then Friday night led to a full-blown press conference, like a scramble of state and local and even some federal delegates who really wanted to impress upon the Portlanders and the protest crowd that they were starting to see something. A surge in surge in federal forces was their phrasing. And how the message that they wanted to strike was for protesters, don't take the bait. So at this Friday night, it felt like there was something coming, but we weren't quite sure what was coming. This was 2 days before Trump ultimately decided or announced he was sending in the troops. And that was the message. It was, don't take the bait.
Stay calm. Right. Yeah. So what you're saying at that point, it was, we just knew there were more troops in town. We didn't know exactly what was happening.
Well, more federal law enforcement, right? I mean,
Sure.
Using
Federal
troops
law
kind
enforcement.
of interchangeably, but we hadn't really heard that, the National Guard was being called.
Or what exactly was happening, right?
A lot of unclarity.
But then Saturday morning, got a little bit more clarity. Trump announced, I think on Truth Social, that he wanted to deploy troops to Portland to protect the, quote, war-ravaged city with a specific focus on protecting the ICE facility in Southwest Portland that we're mentioning. You two have spent a good amount of time outside the facility. Protests have been going on down there since around May. Does the president's version or illustration of what was going on down there and kind of this idea of destruction and, a city on fire, does that match what you've seen firsthand? Paint us a picture kind of over the past few months.
Yeah. I mean, we don't quite know exactly what the president's been seeing, right? But certainly there's been a lot of B-roll that's getting played of 2020 protests where we had the social justice protests for more than 100 nights.
What have y'all seen, though?
Well, I mean, what I've seen is a lot of different things happening, actually. It's ebbed and flowed. There's been a lot of quiet nights. On a quiet night, you're seeing maybe dozens of protesters, and they're yelling at the ICE building, but they're also wearing costumes. Like, there's been images of this guy in a chicken suit that's been circulating on a lot of different articles, dancing, but also, protesting for trying to get in the faces of federal law enforcement when they're trying to do an armed escort of vehicles in and out of the building. But I will also say, the disconnect here is noticeable, too, because even Oregon's law enforcement has come out. Portland Police Chief Bob Day earlier this week made a point to say that if there's these images of the whole city in disrepair, this is just one city block. And he's very much pointed out the fact that it's very contained.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really small area outside of, downtown Portland. It's kind of sandwiched between the Willamette River and I-5, and it's just, I think, really important to stress that so many times I bike by there twice a day, and a handful of times, once, twice, I've not been able to bike through there, either because the bike path has been closed for a protest or something. But it's usually, a very small number of people. There are some nights where, 40, 50 people have showed up, but a lot of it's holding signs. And, there also have been times when we've seen things kind of pop off. I mean, in June, there were some bigger protests, like after the No Kings rally, that afternoon and into the evening. I mean, we had hundreds of people out there, and there was a pretty big response from the federal law enforcement officers that were there, tear gas. Protesters tried to, break into the building. So, I mean, it's not like there haven't been these moments that have flared up, but, hours and hours of what has happened there has been people holding signs. There's legal observers outside as people are going in to check in with ICE, because that's a working building where people need to come in and do a check-in on their immigration status. There's clergy out there, I mean, and so there's just it's a small area within the city, and overall, quiet.
It's also true, though, correct me if you think I'm wrong, right? It's a small amount of people, dozens of people, right? Very vocal, persistent protesters, heckling,
Yes.
disrupting. There are skirmishes, though, that occur, right? So I think this is where this has taken on some legs, is there is footage of troops sort of coming out, or officers coming out in block, maybe scooping someone up and arresting them for something, maybe putting down some sort of gas or firing pepper balls. I don't have any clarity on how often that has happened, but there's these little skirmishes that seem to occur out there.
And that's the thing that even yesterday we were kind of talking about this with our editor. How do we talk about an event where, if you look at it, 7 hours, nothing happens, or people are very, very upset about, protesters are really upset about the administration's immigration enforcement policies. And then, there's 20 seconds or 60 seconds or a couple of minutes where there is some really intense interactions between protesters and law enforcement. And if you look at that, couple of minutes or those few seconds, it really looks intense. But taken as a whole, I mean, there's hours of kind of very vocal, but very likely First Amendment protected kind of protest.
And I think that just speaks to the larger issue of the initial question of what we're seeing versus what everybody else is seeing. Is It's very easy. There's a lot of people down there who are live streaming or taking video, particularly people who might be described as influencers or something, who can very easily snip the most exciting piece of footage, and that's the one that circulates.
Well, that's what I want to get into. You mentioned these 2020 videos that have been going around too. Can you kind of get into why we think Donald Trump and higher ups in the administration are painting this picture of Portland as war ravaged, as akin to World War II? Just these wild kind of phrases. It's a little puzzling, frankly, to hear the city and even around the ICE facility described this way. So what do you think, where is that communication coming from?
I mean, I don't know if I can say where Trump is seeing things. I mean, but we can point to the fact that it's clearly, it was on display this weekend, not at the protest, but in his conversations with Governor Tina Kotek. Those text messages became public, and even before the text messages, there was reports where he was saying, maybe I'm not seeing what you're seeing. And, clearly some kind of
information gap.
Yeah. And so then...
I think he said something that was if what I'm seeing on TV, is that not what's actually happening?
Right.
Yeah.
And then Sunday rolls around, though, and we see this text message where he's telling Kotek that Saturday night was... just irresponsible. The city was out of control.
Sure.
And I can tell you I was there Saturday night, and it was extremely uneventful.
Well, and just the fact that he keeps saying the city's on fire. I mean, I went back and looked through, there's a post-millennial reporter that has been on the ground very often, right? And it takes a lot of footage, and I think that's where a lot of national media footage has come from. I don't know that I saw a fire, maybe a tiny fire in the driveway, but this is not 2020 where things were burning more forcefully. And it just makes you wonder. I think a lot of people are assuming at this point. The governor has said this. Mayor Keith Wilson has said this. Like, we kind of think he's looking at recirculated stuff from 2020. And the clue is, like, just the descriptors seem so far off. I mean, if he was describing massive conflicts with troops and protesters, like I could see how he got there based on like a limited clip. It's just the burn your city to the ground stuff has no resemblance to anything I've seen in the footage of most recent stuff or personally.
Well, and it also fits in with kind of a national narrative, right? That the White House is putting out. It's the left is dangerous. The left needs to be contained. I mean, this is very much so. Like, Portland is a very, for the most part, very progressive city politically, and this sort of plays into the anti-Antifa. Can you say that? Antifa rhetoric, and just sort of the like the left is dangerous, and then you have kind of these protests where you look at a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds that take place, and it sort of fits into that national context that is also part of the mix here.
Well, let's zoom out a little bit more to put it in context. We heard from Trump over the past weeks and months at different press events about wanting to crack down on Portland. Portland came up when talking about other cities and how we wanted to maybe send the troops there. Mm-hmm. But I think he said something like, it's like living in hell in Portland. Just kind of these like off the cuff, frankly rude comments about Portland. I'm curious if this news of him wanting to send troops here came as a surprise. It did feel like we were a little all on unawares on Friday and Saturday when this came up. But were you guys surprised? Did it feel like this was the path that we were on?
I felt like, maybe Conrad feels different, but it seemed to me I was kind of half expecting something to occur, not necessarily this last weekend, but at some point, for the reasons that you just talked about, that he was kind of always name-checking Portland in some fashion. And then we also know, Portland has itself a history with Trump. In 2016, when he was elected, there was a large protest here that made national news. Mm-hmm. And then he sent the troops, the federal troops here in 2020. And so
federal law enforcement.
Federal law enforcement, yes, you're right. So there's I guess, to me, it always seemed like if he was always, well, let's take a step back too. He also, in the weeks, just a couple weeks ago, had made a point to designate Antifa a domestic terror group. Mm-hmm. And so when you do something like that, it felt like there was somewhere in the Pacific Northwest that he was going to be looking at, and Portland certainly seemed like a target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I was, I think I was surprised, but I was also sort of like, what, does this mean what it sounds like, right?
Sure.
Are we just talking about more federal law enforcement officers, or do we actually, are we talking about like a militarized National Guard presence under the direction of the Department of Defense? And when it became clear it was the latter, that to me was like, oh, wow, like now we're in new territory.
Sure. Yeah. So back to the timeline of events from last weekend. I want to kind of explore how local officials responded to it. Can you guys kind of recap to us how the governor and the mayor and other local electeds responded to this threat, deploying the National Guard on Saturday? They held a press conference, right?
Yeah, so we all kind of woke up Saturday to learn that this had happened, right? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't totally clear what did happen. What we know now is that on Friday, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem asked the Department of Defense for National Guard troops. On Saturday, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, sent a notice to Oregon saying, we would like you to call up 200 troops, Governor. We're authorizing to pay for that. Please do this. And if you don't, by the way, we're probably going to federalize these guys in 12 hours. That set forth this discussion with Trump and Kotek that I think you've talked a little bit about, Troy. But what they essentially said was, again, they had this press conference on the waterfront. It was much as you described at top, Alex, right? They're on the waterfront. People are biking by. It's kind of a lovely autumn day. They're making the case that, look at this lovely backdrop. This is clearly not what the president is saying. But the basic thing is, we do not need troops here. This is not an insurrection. This is not a national security threat. This is not the kind of things that people are explaining. It's just a city that's having a block's worth of protests. That is how the city and state leaders would describe it.
And it's worth noting that all the folks at this press conference, I mean, our governor, our mayor, all of our city councilors and county officials are largely Democrats or all Democrats,
Yes.
and pretty left leaning. What can you tell us, kind of what Republicans in the state of Oregon were
Sure.
saying at the time? It was a bit of a different picture.
Yeah. So, I think let's start with Lori Chavez DeRemer. She's the labor secretary, but before that, she represented the 5th District, the Oregon Congressional District. She has been vocal for a while now that she thinks something needs to happen in Portland. In this publicized cabinet hearing with Trump in August, she said, "Thank you so much, Mr. President, for what you're doing. I really hope you'll send troops to Portland or you'll crack down on Portland," I think was her wording at the time. When Trump announced this on Saturday, she tweeted, she said, and I'll quote, "I've seen firsthand how lawlessness has transformed Portland from a beautiful place to live to a crime-ridden war zone. Thank you, POTUS, for taking action to keep our ICE facilities protected and make America safe again." Another Republican in the state level who's been vocal about this is Christine Drazan. She's the former Republican gubernatorial candidate, right? She's a state representative now. She put out a release Saturday saying, these claims that there's nothing going on here, that there's no national security threat are what she would call tone deaf. She wrote, "It is shameful that state and local leaders have allowed violent mobs and domestic terrorists to assault federal law enforcement and destroy property." So that's the vibe. But I will say we haven't heard a ton, the legislature was in session this week, right? They were passing this transportation package. I assumed when I walked into the Senate on Monday morning, we were going to get a lot of fireworks back and forth. And we really didn't. We heard a lot of Portland Democrats making the case that we've talked about, that this is not necessary. Portland's a lovely city. It has its issues, but we don't need troops. The only Republican who really spoke much to it was Senator Daniel Bonham of the Dells, and he didn't say much. Here's a snippet of what he said.
Out of curiosity, have you read the lawsuit? Have you seen what's happening in Portland? There is something happening, and it's not mostly peaceful protests.
There is something happening. He seemed like he was hesitating to say much because I doubt he's been down there. He was pointing people to a video he had watched. But that is really the breadth of what we've seen so far, at least that I've been clocking.
Well, one thing that has struck me, and you kind of mentioned this, and I should give credit to our colleague Dave Miller, who kind of mentioned this yesterday when we were chatting about it, but the way that people are talking about this moment, Republicans and folks outside of Portland largely, feels really really similar to how we heard Portland being portrayed in 2020. And even before then, when we'd see frequent clashes between kind of far right and far left folks in downtown Portland, 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, those protests, but kind of Portland being talked about as this, leftist city, with crazy politics and policies that allowed for rampant drug use and homelessness and crime. And, we'd see images of protesters getting in brawls with each other and police. Actual things were on fire at the time. But I would argue that has changed. The needle has moved a bit, at least locally since then. Voters elected a way more law and order moderate district attorney. The state legislature reversed Measure 110 to recriminalize drug use. We have a more moderate mayor who came in with a pretty clear goal to end homelessness. Crime is down, fewer tents in the streets, fewer people using drugs. All these bits and pieces. But I'm curious if the way that kind of the critics are talking about the city right now and the president, does that surprise you at all? What is your perception of the city's overall health right now?
I think that this whole conversation lacks a lot of nuance, right?
Sure.
So on the one hand, we're hearing it's a paradise. You're biking up Mount Tabor and getting a coffee and going to a restaurant and a sporting event. On the other hand, you're hearing Portland is a pile of ashes next to the Willamette River, right? And it's neither. It is a place that has struggled to come back from the pandemic. We all know that. It is a place where you can still see people living on the street, having mental health crises. Probably there's more trash and graffiti than many of us would like. I doubt there's a single resident of this city who would disagree with any of those points. But it is better in many of the respects that you've said. I think a lot of people feel like it is trending in the right direction, and it is certainly just not a on-fire war zone. So I don't know. I don't know that I can say anything surprises me with the political rhetoric of the day. I just wish there was a little more nuance. I wish it didn't have to be the most beautiful place on earth or the most drug-ravaged hellhole. I wish we could talk a little more honestly. I know that's not where politics is, so probably it's dumb of me to wish that. But
yeah, I mean, everything. I agree with everything both of you have said. Just that crime is down, homicides are down. I mean, it is not 2020 by a long stretch. And at the same time, Portland has a long history of really vehement protests. I mean, very strong sense of, speaking out against policies, whether they're state or local or, national policies or, elections throughout, for years. I mean, the ICE facility has been something that has been the source of protests on and off. It doesn't mean that it's, driven by some leftist ideology that needs to be rooted out, as the president seems to suggest. I mean, it's people that are very frustrated at different times with federal immigration policies and that kind of thing. When it comes to the city's overall health, I mean, I agree that there are definitely livability issues. I mean, there are issues with education. There are issues with housing costs. Some of the jokes I heard over the weekend involving just the streets, the city's streets just full of potholes and in really rough shape, I mean, there are problems, but it's not a war zone. And to call it that is disingenuous. And what I heard actually over the weekend, right, was and it seemed to be sort of an olive branch in a way of let's engage with the White House from local leaders. Let's engage with the White House in a way that is constructive, in a way that allows us to solve some of these issues that we're struggling with. The mayor talked about SNAP benefits or just healthcare costs, those kind of things that would in the minds of state and local officials be far more helpful than federalizing 200 National Guard troops to stand outside an ICE facility.
And will Trump take that bait? Probably not. So, I think the big question hanging in the air right now, as you sit here on Thursday, is what does it look like for National Guard to come to Portland? What does that deployment look like in real life? We've seen it happen in a few other cities across the U.S. since January. When will it happen? I mean, what do we know for sure right now about what that could look like and when it could happen?
I think it's a good question because we've seen federal law enforcement, we've seen the National Guard deployed in a couple of different ways. We know that in Washington, D.C., for example, when they were deployed there was just as much traffic enforcement as much as cleaning up the parks. We do know also with Oregon's National Guard that so far the only clear indication of what their actual job responsibilities will be is to protect federal property and protect federal personnel. Now, that doesn't just mean the ICE building. That could also mean other federal buildings in downtown. But just this sort of site security and personnel security is the only thing that we can point to right now as the clear job that they have on the table right now. But we also, not to get ahead of it too much, but we don't necessarily know. That could change. We don't know fully how things are. It's not just the National Guard, it's also these federal law enforcement. There's certainly, we've heard from protesters some consternation about to what degree this influx of personnel will be doing immigration enforcement and trying to enforce Trump's deportation plans. I can just tell you right now, from my perspective, when I go out there, I'm kind of just looking for anything different. We saw over the weekend, for example, suddenly there was a helicopter that we had not seen before, and that was flying pretty low, and seeing new uniforms out there that we had not seen before. And all of these things are just, as it's happening in the moment, things that are kind of guiding our coverage to figure out what exactly they're doing.
Well, one thing you had reported over the weekend that I thought was really interesting was that, the even talk of the National Guard before, folks seemed to be there, right? It was driving more people out to the ICE facility. It was kind of growing the size of the protests. And it makes me wonder, does federalizing these National Guard troops, is that sort of injecting, right, something into, I guess just injecting kind of something into a very not a volatile situation, but making it more volatile.
Well, that's the bait,
That's
right?
what happened.
That's the bait.
And that's what happened in 2020, right?
Yeah.
Like things were kind of chilling out in Portland protests. And then Trump called on, federal law enforcement to come to town and just seeing what that looks like on the ground. I mean, you saw a huge amount of folks come out who maybe hadn't protested at all. You saw
Right.
Ted Wheeler, then Mayor Ted Wheeler, come out and get tear gassed. I mean, they point to that moment. Elected officials point to that moment as like the tinderbox.
Well, I think it is, to your point, and there is a really good question here about to what degree the bait will be taken, right? I'm using air quotes for this one, because obviously, like over the weekend, you saw Friday night was relatively calm. Saturday night was a little bit busier. Sunday night was very busy. Lots of people and different types of people, right? So you weren't just seeing the typical protesters, that small persistent group that we've been talking about, but also like moms and grandmas and kids who were just kind of coming out
Looky-loos.
Kind of curious, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, I talked to people and asked them about all of this conversation. People talking that how they just came from a book signing or an improv class on the way to the protest. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the city reacts to this. I do want to make a mention of the fact that like the "don't take the bait" rhetoric it's really interesting because there are a number of protesters down there. And I don't think this will surprise people who've covered protests in the past, but that language sort of implies to them that they were the ones escalating tensions in the first place, right? Sure. That they're it's on them not to escalate the tensions.
It's a bit victim blamey.
Yeah. I think some folks would say, certainly like we've talked about actions that protesters have taken, like trying to use a stop sign to like barge through the front door, certainly escalating things, but also times when they're just out there and you do see people sitting on the property and get pepperballed for not moving fast enough. I mean, so I think that is just something that I'm very cognizant of as I'm reporting.
I want to note just some quick logistics because we don't know a lot about what this looks like, but we do know a little bit, right? We learned this week that the National Guard is pulling from two companies in the state. One is based in Woodburn, one is based in Salem. One of those is actually an outfit of military police officers. So they are pulling from groups that they say have had crowd control training, have relevant skills to this mission, even though we don't know a ton about the mission, that there is apparently some specialization going on there. We also know that allegedly this is going to cost about up to $10 million for troop salaries, for lodging, for meals, for equipment. That is
the federal government then.
That's right. The federal government will pay it, which is shut down as we record this, by the way. Just some logistics we know. We don't know exactly. I think it will look more like Los Angeles than Washington, just given this is the same kind of order that Los Angeles saw, but no idea what it actually looks like.
Do we know if the federal government shutdown is going to affect the deployment?
No, it's not going to affect the deployment. I think what I tried to read up on it yesterday, and I think that it's possible troops will be asked to carry out the mission without pay and then get paid later. But I actually don't quote me on that because I'm not exactly sure.
All right.
Start printing money. So you mentioned Los Angeles and D.C., and it's been mentioned a few times here, but I'm curious if there are any lessons from either of those deployments and the way that the law got involved. Kind of, there were different lawsuits that came up after the fact, especially in L.A. Anything that can inform what might happen here in Portland? And also, I mean, maybe one of you can kind of explain the legal the lawsuit that's been filed as well.
Sure. So let's start there. I mean, on Sunday, right, Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, Governor Tina Kotek, and Portland Mayor Keith Wilson, had kind of a quickly put together kind of Zoom press conference, right? And they announced that they were filing a lawsuit to try and block the deployment, saying that it was unlawful. And they also, on Monday, filed what's called a temporary restraining order, which basically says you need, before this case, like, the deployment needs to stop now because there'll be irreparable harm, we think, if it's allowed to go forward. And it's sort of an emergency measure within the overall lawsuit. And that's all going to play out tomorrow in federal court, the temporary restraining order. The lawsuit's going to take a lot longer because lawsuits take a long time. Taking kind of a step back, I have spent a good chunk of the week sort of speaking with legal experts just who have tracked this sort of thing and have a real strong sense of the role the courts play, presidential powers, the role the military plays in civilian life, and that kind of thing. And, it's pretty undisputed that the presidency carries a legal authority to federalize Guard members. But the thing is, it's not absolute under, every circumstance. And so the situation playing out in Oregon, it does raise a number of legal issues that, I think could sort of clarify some of the limitations. I spoke with Georgetown law professor Stephen Vladeck. He's an expert on federal courts, military justice, and national security. And here's what he told me.
The president, for better or for worse, has long had very broad authority to federalize state National Guard troops, even in circumstances in which we might not agree that the facts on the ground warrant it.
And so, the thing is, for this to be sort of deemed lawful, there have to be certain conditions that are met. And other law professors and kind of experts I've spoken with say that they don't think that the criteria even though statutorily, right, the president can do this on paper, the circumstances on the ground are not ones that make it lawful. There have to be an insurrection or, a foreign invasion or an inability. And this is the one that is kind of a maybe in the eyes of some of the folks I spoke with, but an inability of the president to enforce or carry out federal law. Other folks point out to the fact that ICE is still able to do its job. I mean, there are still immigration arrests taking place. People are coming and going out of the building. Yes, it's boarded up. Yes, maybe some of those operations are hampered from time to time. But, ICE is carrying out its duties. So they kind of say it's not an inability that maybe doesn't hold a lot of water here. When I spoke with Rachel Vandenheim, when I spoke with Rachel Vandenheim, she's a professor at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles, and she also is a retired lieutenant colonel. She spent 2 decades in the U.S. Air Force, and she had a really interesting point that I think is worth kind of hearing.
The president is chipping away at long-standing understandings of how the military works in our constitutional democracy. And to me, that's very scary because he's normalizing seeing troops on our city streets.
And that idea, right, normalizing troops on our streets, right? I mean, legally speaking, it's very possible that, the National Guard members are going to be able to stand outside that facility as sort of a show of force and not do anything. If they start engaging in law enforcement activities, that's kind of what happened in Los Angeles, and that was deemed unlawful. But this idea that we're just used to seeing the military on our streets, it kind of, she articulated really well, that's what, she said that's what King George II did, and that's what set off the Revolutionary War. There's something deep within kind of the American psyche that, we don't use the military to police. And it's sort of seen as something that happens overseas.
Well, I should note that earlier, I think yesterday morning, we heard President Trump speak to a room full of hundreds of members of the military and say specifically that, he wants these cities to be kind of, I think a training ground was his words for the military. And these are U.S. cities. This is not usually where training for overseas military action takes place. And that's unusual.
Oh, yeah.
I know what it means. I mean, the other thing I would point out, just to add to Conrad, the way that the president called these folks up matters. So I mentioned earlier, Hegseth, the Department of Defense, wanted Governor Kotek to invoke Title 32 and call them up really under her authority. She didn't do that. And as I understand the law, that will then limit what the National Guard is allowed to do. They would have more broad leeway in their mission if Title 32 had been invoked. Instead, this is a Title 10 deployment, which means they are solely under the control of the federal government. But as Conrad mentioned, that limits what you can do. They need to, as I understand the law, be protecting, federal functions and not acting as law enforcement. And that's why, as Conrad said, Los Angeles, a judge there ruled what they'd been doing was not lawful.
And when I talked to Professor Vladeck from Georgetown, I mean, one thing he did kind of say was, it was deemed when kind of the National Guard was going along with immigration raids or kind of helping enforce immigration laws, acting like law enforcement, that was the part, right, that was deemed unlawful.
Right.
But from the administration's perspective, he said, the overall win here is that they did call up thousands of National Guard members and sent hundreds of members of the active duty military to an American city. And, he kind of said, like, in their mind, and he agreed with what Rachel had said, sort of that there was this overall kind of, concern he had that normalizing the presence of troops in American streets is something that, the administration is trying to find exactly where is the line that we can push right up to before, we've crossed it.
And one more question that just came up as you were explaining the legal ruling out of LA. I mean, that decision, how does that impact what a judge might rule on in Oregon?
Oh, that's a really good question. So it only applies in California, and actually the judge there stayed it and allowed the administration to appeal it to the Ninth Circuit. So it's before the Ninth Circuit. Oregon's part of the Ninth Circuit. But when Judge Simon it takes up the case, there's no binding kind of part. It's more something that he can look to what a colleague did in California and say, gosh, like, many of these circumstances are the same, whether or not he reaches the same conclusion or whether, in fact, all the facts on the ground, are exactly the same is something that will kind of come out in the course of the trial.
Well, certainly looking forward to, I'll speak for probably everyone, kind of what comes from that hearing tomorrow, when or where we'll start seeing more military action in Portland. And I know all of y'all and me will be keeping a close eye on it for all of our listeners. We will leave our conversation there for today. Thank you all for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Alex.
You're welcome, Alex.
Thanks.
This week's episode was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We will be back next week with more news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.